June 6, 1944, 0016 hours, Sainte-Mère-Église, Normandy. Oberst Friedrich von der Heide sat in the officers' mess of the 6th Fallschirmjäger Regiment, a glass of cognac warming in his palm. Outside, the Norman night hung thick and quiet. Inside, his fellow officers were laughing. "The Americans are sending paratroopers," Hauptmann Erich Weinberg said, his face flushed with wine and amusement. "Can you imagine? Farm boys who learned to jump 3 months ago, dropping into France against the finest soldiers in the Wehrmacht." Von der Heide smiled, but it was a thin smile. He was a paratrooper himself, a veteran of Crete, where German airborne forces had paid for victory and blood. He knew what paratroopers could do, but he also knew the reports. American airborne training was rushed, their units were green, and their doctrine was untested in combat. "They'll break their legs in the hedgerows," another officer chimed in, "if they even find each other in the dark." The laughter continued. No one noticed when the first distant rumble of aircraft engines began somewhere over the channel. At that exact moment, 13,100 American paratroopers from the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions were already in the air. They were crammed into 822 C-47 transport aircraft, flying in tight formations through clouds and darkness toward drop zones scattered across the Cotentin Peninsula. Most of them were teenagers. Many had never seen combat, all of them were terrified. And within 6 hours, they would accomplish something the German High Command had deemed impossible. The German assessment of American airborne forces in early 1944 was not baseless prejudice. It was calculated military intelligence. And on paper, it looked damning. General Major Wilhelm Falley, commander of the 91st Air Landing Division, had compiled reports on American training methods. His conclusion, filed in April 1944, was dismissive. The American parachute soldier receives approximately 8 to 12 weeks of specialized training compared to our 6-month program. They lack the tactical sophistication for independent operations behind enemy lines. Their reliance on planned drop zones and prearranged objectives makes them predictable and vulnerable. The German General Staff believed several things about American paratroopers. First, they were too dependent on equipment. American airborne units carried an average of 120 to 150 pounds of gear per man, everything from reserve parachutes to leg bags full of ammunition and explosives. German intelligence calculated that such overloaded soldiers would be immobile and disorganized after landing, easy prey for even modest defensive forces. Second, they lacked the tactical flexibility of German Fallschirmjäger. Wehrmacht doctrine emphasized that paratroopers must operate as independent small units, adapting instantly to unexpected situations. American doctrine, by contrast, appeared rigid and hierarchical. Soldiers waiting for officers, officers waiting for orders, orders waiting for radios that wouldn't work in hedgerow country. Third, and most critically, German officers believed Americans couldn't fight effectively at night. This wasn't racism, it was historical analysis. American forces in North Africa and Italy had shown a consistent preference for daylight operations, with elaborate preparation and overwhelming firepower. The idea that they could drop in darkness, organize in chaos, and attack immediately seemed fantastical. Night operations require a level of unit cohesion and individual initiative that takes years to develop. If von der Heide wrote in his own assessment, "The Americans simply haven't had the time," the numbers supported this view. The 82nd Airborne Division had been activated in August 1942, less than 2 years before D-Day. The 101st Airborne was even younger, activated in August 1943. By comparison, German airborne forces had been conducting operations since 1940, with veterans who had jumped into Denmark, Norway, the Netherlands, Crete, and the Eastern Front. But there was one thing the German intelligence reports missed entirely. American paratroopers weren't trying to be German paratroopers. They were something different, something the Wehrmacht had never faced before. 0113 hours, 1,500 feet above Normandy. Private First Class John Steele of Company F, 505 Parachute Infantry Regiment, 82nd Airborne Division, stood in the door of his C-47 as tracers carved red lines through the night sky. The pilot was weaving, the plane was shaking, and men were screaming to be heard over the engines and the anti-aircraft fire. The green light came on. Steele jumped. What happened next was supposed to be a textbook combat jump. Exit aircraft, count to 4, parachute deploys, guide yourself to the drop zone. Hit the ground, assemble with your unit, move to objective. Total time from exit to combat readiness, approximately 15 minutes. What actually happened was chaos on an almost incomprehensible scale. The C-47 formations had been scattered by clouds, evasive maneuvers, and German flak. Pilots, unable to see landmarks in the darkness, dropped their sticks of paratroopers wherever they happened to be when the green light came on. Some planes dropped too low as 300 feet, giving parachutes barely enough time to open. Others dropped too fast, the planes traveling over 150 miles per hour instead of the planned 110, which meant paratroopers were scattered across miles of countryside instead of concentrated on drop zones. The 101st Airborne's Pathfinders, the elite troops who were supposed to mark drop zones with lights and radar beacons, had themselves been scattered. Of the 120 Pathfinders from the 101st, only 38 landed near their intended drop zones. The main force of 6,600 paratroopers from the 101st jumped into a fog of confusion. Only one stick of troops landed where they were supposed to. The rest came down scattered across 25 miles of hedgerow country. The 82nd Airborne fared slightly better, but only slightly. Colonel Gavin, the assistant division commander, landed with only one other soldier from his stick. The 507th Parachute Infantry Regiment saw men landing in trees and rivers, in flooded fields, on rooftops and in the middle of German encampments. Private Steele's parachute caught on the church steeple in Sainte-Mère-Église. He hung there for 2 hours, playing dead, as German soldiers shot American paratroopers in the town square below. He watched men die. He waited. And when the Germans finally cut him down, he waited some more for his chance to escape, which he did, rejoining American forces 3 days later. By 0200 hours, the drop was complete. 13,000 American paratroopers were scattered across Normandy. Unit cohesion was effectively zero. Communications were non-existent. Most soldiers had no idea where they were, couldn't find their officers, and had lost most of their equipment in hard landings or when leg bags tore away. In command posts across the peninsula, German officers received reports and allowed themselves to relax. The American airborne assault was a disaster. The invaders were scattered, disorganized, and vulnerable. Mopping them up would be a simple matter. But something was happening in the hedgerows that the Germans didn't understand yet. Something that would change the equation entirely. 02:15 hours. Somewhere in the darkness near Drop Zone D, Lieutenant Richard Winters of Easy Company, 506 Parachute Infantry Regiment, 101 Airborne Division, crouched in a hedgerow with 3 men he'd never met before. 2 were from different companies. 1 was from a different regiment entirely. None of them knew exactly where they were. Winters had been trained for this moment, but not in the way anyone expected. The standard military response to disorganization is to reorganize. Establish a command post, account for your men, issue orders through proper channels. But American airborne commanders had anticipated that the drop might be chaotic. So they'd trained their men to do something radical. Keep fighting regardless of organization. Every paratrooper carried a small brass cricket, a child's toy that made a distinctive clicking sound. 1 click was a challenge. 2 clicks in response meant friend. It was simple, foolproof, and nearly impossible to replicate by Germans who didn't have the devices. But more importantly, every paratrooper had been drilled on immediate action. If you can't find your unit, find any American soldier and form a combat team. If you can't find an officer, the senior enlisted man takes command. If you don't know where the objective is, find the nearest German position and attack it. This was heresy to traditional military doctrine. Soldiers without officers, units without organization, combat without orders. The Wehrmacht would never operate this way. German tactical excellence depended on clear chains of command, coordinated movement, and officers who could improvise within the framework of operational goals. But in the hedgerows of Normandy at 02:15 hours on June 6, 1944, the American approach suddenly made perfect sense. Winters clicked his cricket. 2 clicks came back from 3 different directions. Within 5 minutes, he had 11 men, a mixed group from 3 different companies. Within 10 minutes, they'd identified a German position, a farmhouse with a machine gun covering a crossroads. Standard procedure would be to scout the position, report to higher command, request support, and attack with a coordinated plan. Winters did none of these things. He simply attacked immediately with 11 mismatched soldiers who'd met 10 minutes earlier. The assault took 6 minutes. The Germans never had time to call for help. By 0245, Winter's scratch team had killed 4 German soldiers, captured 7 more, destroyed a machine gun position, and secured a key crossroads. Then they moved to find the next target. This scene was repeating itself across the entire peninsula. Small groups of American paratroopers, 5 men here, 8 men there, sometimes just 2 soldiers, were emerging from the chaos and immediately attacking anything German they could find. These weren't coordinated assaults. There was no grand tactical plan, but there didn't need to be, because what the Germans were experiencing was something they'd never encountered. Thousands of enemy soldiers appearing everywhere at once, attacking anything that moved, impossible to track or predict, operating with a level of decentralized aggression that violated every assumption about how soldiers were supposed to behave. A German after-action report from the 91st Air Landing Division, filed days later, captured the confusion. The enemy appears to be attacking in all directions simultaneously. Small groups of 5 to 15 men are engaging our positions without regard for their own safety or tactical situation. They do not wait for reinforcement. They do not establish defensive positions. They simply attack, then disappear, then attack again elsewhere. It is impossible to establish a coherent picture of their strength or intentions. 0430 hours, 2 miles south of Sainte-Mère-Église. General Major Wilhelm Falley was driving back to his headquarters when his staff car rounded a bend and drove straight into an American patrol. Falley was the commander of the 91st Air Landing Division, one of the primary units responsible for defending the Cotentin Peninsula. He had spent the evening at a war game exercise in Rennes, confident that any Allied invasion could be contained by morning. The reports of scattered paratroopers had been concerning but not alarming. Scattered troops were easy to hunt down. But Falley never made it back to his command post. The patrol that intercepted him consisted of exactly 4 paratroopers from the 508th Parachute Infantry Regiment, 82nd Airborne Division. They had been lost for 3 hours, had no idea where they were, and were looking for anyone who could tell them where their battalion might be. What they found instead was a German general's staff car traveling without escort. The firefight lasted perhaps 30 seconds. When it was over, General Major Wilhelm Falley was dead, the first German general killed on D-Day. His staff car was burning, his maps and documents were captured, and 4 lost American paratroopers had just decapitated the German defensive command in a chance encounter that no planner on either side could have predicted. This was the hidden power of the airborne assault, randomness as a weapon. The German defensive strategy depended on coordinated response. When the invasion came, specific units would move to specific positions under specific orders from specific commanders. The entire system was designed for efficiency and control. But what happens when your commanders are dead and nobody knows who killed them? What happens when you can't identify where the attacks are coming from because they're coming from everywhere? What happens when every road might have an ambush, every field might have enemy soldiers, and every decision has to be made without intelligence because your intelligence network has collapsed? By 0500 hours, the 91st Air Landing Division had effectively ceased to function as a coherent unit. Not because it had been destroyed. Most of its soldiers were still alive and ready to fight, but because its command structure had been shattered. Officers couldn't reach their units, units couldn't reach their rally points, and everywhere, small groups of American paratroopers were hitting them with attacks that came out of nowhere and vanished just as quickly. Oberst von der Heide, attempting to move his own regiment into position, found himself blocked at every turn. "We are not fighting a coherent enemy force," he radioed to higher command. "We are fighting thousands of individual enemies who appear and disappear at will. I cannot establish a defensive line because there is no line to defend against." 0430 hours, Sainte-Mère-Église Town Square. Lieutenant Colonel Edward Krauss of the 3rd Battalion, 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment, had a problem. He was supposed to capture Sainte-Mère-Église with his entire battalion, approximately 600 men. Instead, he had 180 paratroopers in. most of whom he'd found scattered across 5 miles of countryside. His battalion was still landing. Some men were still in the air, others were dead or captured, and many were simply lost in the darkness. Standard military logic said to wait, consolidate forces, establish proper command and control, and attack with adequate strength. Krauss attacked immediately. Sainte-Mère-Église was the first town in France to be liberated on D-Day, and it happened not because of careful planning, but because a lieutenant colonel, with a third of his force, decided that waiting was more dangerous than attacking. The assault was improvised chaos. Small teams of paratroopers infiltrated from different directions simultaneously. There was no coordinated fire support, no artillery preparation, no unified command, just soldiers moving through streets and buildings, clearing rooms, killing or capturing Germans who were still trying to figure out what was happening. By 0430 hours, the town was secure. Krauss himself climbed the town hall and raised an American flag, not the large ceremonial flag he was supposed to carry, which he'd lost in the jump, but a small flag from a soldier's pocket. It was wrinkled and barely 3 feet wide, but it was enough. The strategic importance of this moment cannot be overstated. Sainte-Mère-Église sat on the main road, N13, connecting Cherbourg to the invasion beaches. By capturing it before dawn, American paratroopers had blocked the primary route for German reinforcements. The German 91st Air Landing Division couldn't move north. The 709th Infantry Division couldn't move south. And the massive 6th Fallschirmjäger Regiment, von der Heide's elite force, was stuck west of the town, unable to reach the invasion beaches. But beyond the strategic value, the capture of Sainte-Mère-Église represented something psychological. Proof that American paratroopers could accomplish their objectives despite being scattered and outnumbered. The German mockery from hours earlier suddenly seemed hollow. These weren't farm boys stumbling through hedgerows. They were soldiers capturing towns before the sun came up. 0300 to 0600 hours. Murder at river crossings. While Sainte-Mère-Église was falling, another drama was unfolding at the bridges over the Meurthe River. These bridges were critical objectives. Without them, German armor couldn't reach the beaches, and American forces couldn't push inland. The 82nd Airborne had assigned the bridges to specific battalions with detailed plans. Those plans became irrelevant the moment the drop scattered troops across miles of flooded marshland. Instead, the bridges were seized by whoever got there first, and held by whoever had the courage to stay. At La Fière, a single reinforced squad from the 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment reached the bridge at 0400 hours. They numbered exactly 13 men. The German force defending the far side numbered approximately 150 soldiers with machine guns, mortars, and armored support. The Americans attacked anyway. The battle for La Fière Bridge would last 3 days and cost hundreds of lives. But in those first critical hours, 13 paratroopers held the western approach and prevented German forces from crossing. They didn't have artillery. They didn't have radio contact. They didn't even know if other American forces were coming. They just knew that the bridge had to be held, so they held it. At Chef DuPont, Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Shanley found himself with 180 men from 5 different units. A mixed force of 82nd and 101st Airborne soldiers who had no business working together according to standard military organization. But they captured this bridge in a dawn assault that took the German defenders completely by surprise. The Germans had been expecting scattered, disorganized paratroopers. They weren't prepared for a coordinated assault by soldiers who'd met each other an hour earlier. These bridge seizures were textbook examples of what would later be called mission command. The idea that soldiers should understand the commander's intent and accomplish it however they can, regardless of whether they have orders, proper organization, or adequate support. But in June 1944, this wasn't doctrine. It was desperation transformed into victory by soldiers who simply refused to fail. 0600 hours, German defensive positions across the Cotentin Peninsula. As dawn broke on June 6, 1944, German commanders finally began to see the full picture of what had happened during the night. And what they saw was impossible. According to intelligence reports and prisoner interrogations, approximately 13,000 American paratroopers had been dropped. The drop had been scattered and chaotic. By any reasonable military assessment, these forces should have been easy to contain. Scattered troops with no coordination, no heavy weapons, no communications, separated from their officers and cut off from support. Instead, German commanders were looking at a tactical disaster. Major towns occupied, critical bridges seized, roads blocked, command posts destroyed, telephone lines cut, and everywhere, small groups of American soldiers attacking German positions with what seemed like suicidal aggression. Major Wolfgang Kaufmann of the 709th Infantry Division wrote in his log, "We are fighting not against a military force, but against an infection. Small groups appear, attack, and vanish. We send troops to clear them out, and they encounter different groups in different locations. By the time we respond to one attack, 3 more have occurred elsewhere. Our men are exhausted, demoralized, and beginning to see American paratroopers in every shadow." The psychological impact was devastating. German soldiers in Normandy had been expecting an invasion. Yes, but they'd been expecting a conventional invasion. Landing craft on beaches, infantry moving inland in organized formations, tanks rolling down roads. They had defensive plans for that kind of invasion. They knew how to fight that kind of battle. But they had no plan for this. No plan for an enemy that was simultaneously everywhere and nowhere, that attacked without apparent coordination, that wouldn't stay in one place long enough to be destroyed. More critically, the German command structure, so efficient in conventional operations, was proving dangerously vulnerable to this kind of warfare. Officers couldn't issue orders to units they couldn't contact. Units couldn't execute plans when the situation changed every 15 minutes. And nobody could establish what military theorists call situational awareness, a clear picture of where your forces are, where the enemy is, and what's actually happening. The scattered drop that German officers had mocked 12 hours earlier had become a strategic masterpiece, not through planning but through the sheer adaptability of individual soldiers. Throughout June 6th, individual acts of extraordinary courage were occurring across the battlefield. These weren't planned operations or coordinated assaults. They were moments when soldiers made split-second decisions that changed the course of the battle. Lieutenant Colonel Robert Cole of the 502nd Parachute Infantry Regiment found himself with 70 men trying to capture a farmhouse complex defended by over 200 German soldiers. The position was critical. It controlled a causeway that American forces from Utah Beach needed to use. Standard tactics said to wait for reinforcements and heavy weapons. Cole didn't wait. He led a bayonet charge across 150 yards of open ground under machine gun fire. 40 of his men were killed or wounded in the charge, but they took the position. For this action, Cole would later receive the Medal of Honor, the first American soldier to earn the decoration on D-Day. He wouldn't live to receive it. He was killed in Holland 3 months later. Private Joe Birrell of the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment had an even more remarkable D-Day experience. He landed near Saint-Côme-du-Mont, immediately engaged German forces, and spent the next 7 hours fighting in 6 different skirmishes with 4 different scratch teams of soldiers. He blew up a power station. He helped capture a German artillery position. He guided lost paratroopers to American lines. And at the end of the day, he was captured, beginning an odyssey that would eventually see him escape from a German POW camp, fight with Soviet partisans, and become the only American soldier to serve with both the U.S. Army and Soviet Army in World War II. Staff Sergeant Harrison Summers of the 502nd Parachute Infantry Regiment essentially conducted a one-man assault on an entire German barracks complex. Moving from building to building with just 1 or 2 soldiers providing support, Summers killed over 50 German soldiers and captured 15 more in a 4-hour running battle. He later said he wasn't being heroic, he just couldn't find his commanding officer and figured he should keep fighting until someone told him to stop. These stories, and thousands like them, illustrated the fundamental difference between American airborne operations and traditional military doctrine. The system didn't depend on heroes. It created conditions where ordinary soldiers could become heroes out of necessity, where privates made decisions that colonels should make, where 20-year-old farm boys from Iowa captured strategic objectives because nobody told them it was impossible. By midday on June 6th, the German High Command was beginning to understand what had actually happened. The scattered drop hadn't been a failure. It had been unintentional psychological warfare on a massive scale. Oberst von der Heide, whose regiment was still trying to reach the invasion beaches, wrote a report that day that captured the shifting German assessment. "We have fundamentally misunderstood the nature of American airborne operations. We assumed their dispersed landings indicated poor training and coordination. In fact, it appears to be a deliberate or, at minimum, effectively exploited tactic. By landing scattered across the entire operational area, they have created a situation where we must defend everywhere simultaneously. Every crossroads, every bridge, every farmhouse might contain enemy troops. The psychological effect on our soldiers is severe. They feel surrounded even when outnumbering the enemy. The report continued with an analysis that must have been bitter to write. The American paratrooper is not the poorly trained conscript we were led to expect. He fights with individual initiative and aggression that exceeds even our own Fallschirmjäger. More critically, he appears capable of effective combat operations without officers, without communications, and without clear orders. This makes him nearly impossible to defeat through conventional tactics of disrupting command and control. By evening, German commanders were receiving reports that fundamentally contradicted their morning assessments. American paratroopers weren't disorganized and ineffective. They were capturing objectives faster than German forces could respond. The 101st Airborne had secured all 4 causeway exits from Utah Beach. The 82nd Airborne had blocked every major road from the west. Critical bridges were in American hands, and the expected German counterattack, the rapid mobile response that should have crushed the scattered airborne forces, had never materialized because German units couldn't move through the chaos. Perhaps most humbling was the casualty exchange ratio. Despite being scattered, outnumbered, and cut off from support, American paratroopers had inflicted significantly heavier casualties than they'd suffered. Preliminary counts suggested the Germans had lost over 4,000 soldiers on the Cotentin Peninsula on D-Day, killed, wounded, or captured by approximately 13,000 lightly armed paratroopers. This wasn't supposed to be possible, but victory came at a terrible price that no statistics can fully capture. Of the 13,100 American paratroopers who jumped into Normandy on the night of June 5th to 6th, 1944, approximately 2,500 became casualties within the first 24 hours. Many died in the air, shot by anti-aircraft fire before they ever reached the ground. Others drowned in flooded fields, dragged under by 150 pounds of equipment and waterlogged parachutes. Some broke their backs, landing on roads or smashed through roofs and were killed in the wreckage. And hundreds died in the chaotic firefights that erupted across the peninsula. Private First Class John Steele, who had hung from the church steeple in Saint Mary Église, watched men die in the town square below him. They were shooting paratroopers as they landed, he later recalled. Some of the men were still tangled in their parachutes. They couldn't defend themselves, the Germans just walked up and shot them. I hung there and watched and couldn't do anything except play dead and pray they wouldn't look up. The 507th Parachute Infantry Regiment dropped directly into the flooded Murderay River Valley. Men with 150 pounds of equipment landed in water over their heads. Many drowned before they could release their parachute harnesses. Others managed to cut themselves free, only to die of exposure in the cold water during the hours before dawn. The regiment suffered over 60% casualties in the first day, one of the highest casualty rates of any American unit on D-Day. Some deaths were quick, others were agonizingly slow. Medics moved through hedgerows treating soldiers with inadequate supplies, performing emergency surgery with pocket knives and morphine syringes, holding dying men's hands when nothing else could be done. Lieutenant Dick Winters later wrote about the emotional toll. We lost men who had trained with us for 2 years, men we'd jumped with in practice, shared tents with, played cards with. You land in the dark and you're alone and you keep fighting, and then later, maybe hours later, maybe days, someone tells you that Joe didn't make it, or Bill got captured, or Tom bled out in a hedgerow before the medics could reach him. And you just keep moving because there's nothing else to do. The human cost extended beyond death and injury. Of the approximately 13,000 paratroopers who jumped, nearly 3,000 were unaccounted for by the end of D-Day, lost in the hedgerows, captured, separated from their units, or dead in places where their bodies wouldn't be found for days or weeks. Families back home would receive telegrams over the following weeks, missing in action. Many of those men were dead. Some were prisoners. A few were still hiding in barns and farmhouses, trying to evade capture and reach American lines. September 15, 1984, Normandy, France. 40 years after D-Day, 2 old men stood together in the cemetery at Saint Mary Église. One was a former Wehrmacht officer, The other was a former American paratrooper. They had met at a remembrance ceremony, discovered they had fought against each other in this same town on June 6, 1944, and agreed to return together. The German, now 68 years old, a retired school teacher, spoke first. "I remember when the reports came in that American paratroopers were landing. We laughed. We actually laughed. We thought you would be easy to defeat." The American, 72 years old, a grandfather 6 times over, smiled grimly. "We were terrified. Most of us had never been in combat. Half of us couldn't find our units. We didn't know where we were or what we were doing. But you fought like demons." "We fought like we had no choice." Which I guess we didn't. They walked together through the rows of white crosses. Over 9,300 American soldiers are buried in the Normandy American Cemetery. Many of them were paratroopers who died in those first chaotic hours. The Germans stopped at one cross. "I wonder if I knew him, if we fought against each other that day." "Maybe. Probably." The American paused. "Does it matter now?" "I suppose not, but I think about it. I think about how we underestimated you, how we thought you were boys playing at war, and then..." He trailed off, looking at the endless rows of graves. "And then we won." "Yes, you won. Not because you were better trained or better equipped. You won because you wouldn't quit. Every time we thought we had you contained, you attacked from a different direction. Every time we killed a group of you, 3 more groups appeared. It was like fighting ghosts." The American nodded slowly. "You want to know the truth? We weren't trying to be ghosts. We were just lost. Scared kids trying to complete our missions with whatever we had. We didn't have a grand tactical plan. We just knew we had to keep fighting. That's what made you so dangerous. We kept waiting for you to do something logical, to consolidate, to organize, to attack in a coordinated manner. But you never did. You just kept coming at us. Small groups everywhere. Impossible to track or predict." They stood in silence for a while, 2 old soldiers remembering young men who never got old. Finally, the American spoke again. "You know what I think about when I remember D-Day? Not the fighting, really. Not even the fear. I think about how many of us died doing things we'd been told were impossible. Capturing towns with a handful of men, holding bridges against battalions, fighting all night without officers or orders. The official histories make it sound like a plan, but it wasn't a plan. It was chaos that we somehow turned into victory because we were too stubborn or too stupid to realize we should have lost." The German nodded. "Perhaps that's the lesson. That the best soldiers aren't the ones who follow plans perfectly. They're the ones who accomplish the mission even when the plan falls apart." "Maybe? I don't know. I just know that a lot of good men died here. On both sides. And for what? So we could stand here 40 years later as friends instead of enemies. So that our grandchildren could grow up in peace. Maybe that's enough." They shook hands. An American paratrooper and a German Wehrmacht officer, once sworn to kill each other, now just 2 old men remembering when they were young and the world was on fire. The combat jump into Normandy on June 5th to 6th, 1944, remains one of the most chaotic and successful military operations in history. It succeeded not because of perfect planning or superior equipment, but because American paratroopers were trained to fight effectively even when everything went wrong. The lessons learned in those first hours of D-Day would reshape military doctrine for generations. The concept of decentralized command, of training soldiers to make their own decisions and accomplish missions without constant oversight, became a cornerstone of American military thinking. Modern Special Operations Forces, from Army Rangers to Navy SEALs, trace their philosophical lineage back to those paratroopers who captured towns in the darkness with nothing but courage and initiative. But the statistics, for all their importance, don't capture the human reality. 13,100 American paratroopers jumped into Normandy. Approximately 2,500 became casualties in the first 24 hours. Over 1,500 were killed in action or died of wounds. The 101st Airborne suffered 60% casualties in the first week. The 82nd Airborne suffered 46% casualties in the first week. But every major objective was achieved. The German mockery that had seemed so reasonable on June 5th was revealed as fatal arrogance by June 7th. American paratroopers hadn't just survived the scattered drop, they'd turned it into a weapon that the Wehrmacht had no defense against. Today, memorials across Normandy mark the places where these young men fought and died. Churches, bridges, crossroads, farmhouses, ordinary places made extraordinary by acts of courage that still seem impossible. Perhaps the best epitaph for those paratroopers comes from General James Gavin, who jumped into Normandy as the assistant division commander of the 82nd Airborne and later commanded the division. Decades after the war, he was asked how American paratroopers, so young, so inexperienced, so scattered and disorganized, had accomplished what they did on D-Day. His answer was simple. They were told what needed to be done. Then they went and did it, regardless of the cost. That's all there is to it. And that's everything. The German officers who mocked American paratroopers learned this lesson too late. By the time they realized what they were facing, not farm boys playing at war, but soldiers who simply refused to lose, the battle was already decided. The sun rose on June 6, 1944, over a transformed Normandy. Towns that had been German strongholds were flying American flags. Bridges that should have carried German reinforcements were held by scattered groups of paratroopers. Roads that should have been open were blocked. And everywhere, small groups of exhausted, terrified, determined American soldiers were preparing to fight another day. They had jumped into darkness and chaos. They had landed scattered and alone. They had fought without orders, without support, and often without hope. And they had won. That is the story of the American paratroopers who were mocked before dawn and feared by sunset. Young men who proved that in war, the decisive factor isn't always weapons or training or numbers. Sometimes it's simply the refusal to accept defeat, no matter how impossible victory.